Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even though you said everything you needed to? That strange tension in your chest, the lump in your throat like each word you spoke somehow pulled you further from your own strength. Maybe you've sat at tables, surrounded by people who interrupt, who mock, who speak over others with confidence that feels more like disguised arrogance. And maybe, just maybe, deep down, you've come to believe that staying silent is weakness. That if you don't defend yourself, you're giving up. That not reacting means losing. But what if I told you that's all a lie? What if real power doesn't lie in what you say, but in what you don't? Nietzsche, one of the most misunderstood minds in philosophy, understood something that few are ready to admit. The ones who speak the most often reveal the most, and usually it's their insecurity they're exposing. Those who desperately try to convince others, they're already standing on shaky ground. We've been raised in a world that treats conversation like combat. Defend your point. Justify your belief. Win the debate. But nature, human nature, affirms another path. A quieter, sharper, infinitely more strategic path. Nietzsche believed silence is not emptiness. Silence is presence. It disorients. It throws people off balance. It forces them to face something they've long avoided, themselves. This video is for you, the person who constantly feels overlooked, unheard, dismissed. For the one who leaves a room thinking, did anyone truly understand what I meant? It's for the peacemaker who's grown weary. The one always expected to stay calm, to take the high road while others walk all over you. Maybe you've mistaken your silence for surrender. But today, I want to show you that silence isn't submission, it's strategy. It's strength. It's the kind of quiet that speaks louder than any shout. Because true victory doesn't come from winning an argument. It comes from never needing to have won in the first place. So what makes us so eager to respond, to correct, to make our voices heard? At the core, it's fear. Fear that if we don't speak, we'll lose. Fear that silence will make us invisible. But that's the ego talking, the fragile part of us that can't bear being questioned. The part that mistakes disagreement for threat. And it's this very ego that turns every conversation into a war zone. Nietzsche pointed out that most people don't argue to find truth. They argue to win, to dominate, to validate their worldview. Not because it's built on solid ground, but because, if it's challenged, it might collapse. In that light, arguments aren't acts of understanding. They're desperate defenses. Not shields of wisdom, but weapons of insecurity. The more someone tries to force their truth on you, the more it reveals their own inner chaos. And here's the twist. The moment you feel you have to justify yourself, to defend your position, to prove your point, you've already stepped into their trap. You've accepted their rules. You've agreed to play their game. But what if you didn't? What if, instead of reacting, you paused? What if, instead of defending, you observed? What would happen if your silence became your loudest message? In the next part, we'll dive even deeper into how silence, when used with intention and clarity, becomes not a retreat, but a revolution. Get ready to rethink the rules of every interaction you've ever had. Because once you learn the power of strategic silence, you'll never feel the need to defend yourself the same way again. Even when you stay silent, you might still be caught in the trap, the deep desire to be accepted, validated, and understood. But that, too, is a subtle form of control. Nietzsche had a word for this: herd morality, the mindset of those who live under the weight of others' expectations. They strive to be seen as good, fair, and righteous, all while slowly sacrificing their own authenticity. The tragic irony, that very pursuit of approval is what drains their power. True strength, Nietzsche argued, doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from no longer needing to prove anything at all. It's the ability to hold your ground, even when you're met with mockery, with judgment, with rejection. It's standing firm when no one understands you and remaining unmoved. He wasn't talking about external victories, but internal mastery. The quiet power of someone who remains calm in chaos, steady when the room is shaking. That's a power that grows, paradoxically, when you stop reacting. If you genuinely want to win, not just arguments, but life itself, you need to understand something fundamental. The entire arena of debate is a stage. And the moment you rise too quickly to speak, to defend, to explain, you've already lost your advantage. Nietzsche recognized a painful truth. The reactive mind is not free. It is a mind still enslaved, still dancing to someone else's rhythm. The observing mind, on the other hand, is a dangerous mind, because it doesn't play by the same rules. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be right. It simply sees. So, if reacting is weakness, how do you hold power? If words betray you, how can you make people feel your strength without ever raising your voice? Nietzsche had an answer, and it was one of his most profound ideas. The Bermensch, the overman. This isn't just a person, it's an ideal. A symbol of someone who transcends the limitations of conventional morality, who rises above the games of the crowd and reshapes the world according to their own will. And how does he do it? Through absolute self-control. In the next part, we'll explore this figure in depth. We'll break down how the overman wields silence not as surrender, but as dominance, not as retreat, but as total presence. Because from this point forward, silence doesn't mean you're stepping back. It means you're stepping into a higher form of power. Are you ready for that level? Let's continue. To master silence is to master energy. And in the previous part, we saw how the overman does exactly that. Complete command over one's own energy. That's where true power begins. It's not about suppressing emotions or thoughts. It's about channeling them with absolute precision. Nietzsche's Bermensch operates with strategic restraint. He understands that every word spoken is a move on the board. Every emotional reaction reveals something, a vulnerability, a need, a weakness. And so, he chooses silence. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he doesn't need to speak. He has nothing to prove. His presence alone delivers the message, and that presence, it unsettles, it disturbs. Because when someone refuses to react, when they meet tension with calm and accusations with stillness, it forces the other person to look inward, to hear their own internal noise, with no escape. In a world overflowing with noise, those who can hold silence become the most powerful. Nietzsche envisioned the Bermensch not as a man of brute force, but as a creator of his own path. He does not adopt morality from the crowd. He doesn't live by the rules imposed by others. He builds his own values. His worth is self-defined. That's why he is feared. Because what can you do to someone who doesn't need your validation? How do you manipulate someone who cannot be moved by guilt, fear, or the desire for acceptance? You can't. His silence becomes a fortress, a shield, against every social trick and emotional pressure. And when he finally speaks, it is not to argue, it is to dismantle. A single sentence can shake foundations, not because of its volume, but because of its weight. But this leads us to a deeper, more uncomfortable question. Why does silence feel so threatening to others? Why does it stir anxiety, discomfort, and even hostility? What's happening inside the human psyche when, instead of confrontation, we're met with absence? To answer that, we need to look beyond philosophy and into the depths of psychology. Because silence, though seemingly passive, has a psychological impact far greater than most people realize. It disrupts patterns. It short-circuits expectations. It shakes the foundation of people's emotional defenses. Silence is not just the lack of speech. It is a mirror, and what it reflects can be unbearable. When you refuse to react, you're not just withholding your voice, you're forcing the other person to face their own. You remove the buffer. Suddenly, they're left alone with their thoughts, their logic, their insecurities. And here's the twist. Most people don't talk to express. They talk to defend, to convince, to distract, to hide the growing gap between what they say and who they truly are. So when you don't play along, when you remain silent, their mask begins to fall. They start to feel exposed. Social psychology confirms what Nietzsche already sensed. In moments of confrontation, silence is often interpreted as judgment. Even if you're simply observing, saying nothing at all, the other person starts to squirm. They feel as though you're evaluating them, even if you aren't. They lose control of the interaction, and with it, control of their narrative. And biologically, their brain reacts. The amygdala, the region responsible for fear and anxiety, lights up. They begin to project their own inner fears onto you. Is he judging me? Did she see through my act? Does he know I'm insecure? Without realizing it, they've entered a psychological battlefield where your silence acts like an invisible blade. It slices through ego, through pretense, through false confidence, cleanly, deeply, and without ever being seen. Nietzsche recognized this long before neuroscience or social psychology gave it names. For him, most people were prisoners, not of physical chains, but of mental reflexes. And in the next part, we'll go deeper into that insight, how people live as slaves to reaction, and how breaking free from that reflex is the first real Step 2. Psychological freedom. Are you ready to go there? Let's continue. In the last part, we uncovered how silence not only disrupts others, but forces them to confront the void within. Now, let's look deeper at how that silence reveals who truly holds power. Most people live in reaction. They move on impulse, speak from pride, or act out of a fear of being invisible. They rush to respond, not because they have something meaningful to say, but because they're afraid of being forgotten. Their voice becomes a shield for their insecurity, but the higher mind, the one that has mastered itself, doesn't fall into this trap. It knows that every word spoken is like giving away a piece of the game board. Every unguarded reaction reveals a crack, a soft spot, a weakness that can be used against you. And so, it chooses to remain still, knowing that silence is not surrender, it's strategy. This stillness has a destructive effect on those who manipulate. Manipulators thrive on emotional feedback. They test you, provoke you, bait you, all in an effort to trigger a reaction. Your reaction gives them confirmation. It gives them control. It keeps them in the spotlight. But when you don't respond, the game ends. The spell breaks. And suddenly, they lose their footing without your reaction to mirror back to them who they think they are. They begin to unravel. That confident mask starts slipping, and the weakness they've been hiding becomes exposed. Not because you attacked them, but because you refused to play. Yet, silence doesn't just shake manipulators. It pierces something even deeper. Silence triggers pain. It presses on old wounds, the trauma of being ignored, the fear of rejection, the shame of being invisible. The other person starts to realize, maybe I'm not that important. Maybe my words don't matter. Maybe my presence doesn't leave a mark. And for an ego built on attention, that's unbearable. This is the real sting. When you remain silent, you're not simply protecting yourself. You're hitting the heart of the illusion, showing that they never had power over you to begin with. But don't be mistaken. Silence demands strength, not just from others, but from you, because everything you've been taught urges you to react, to explain, to justify, to make yourself understood, and it will feel unnatural to resist that urge. It will feel like swallowing fire, but it is precisely that difficulty that gives silence its force. It is not passive. It is not weakness. It is discipline. And discipline is what separates those who are controlled from those who controlled themselves. Now that you understand how silence disturbs the emotional landscape of others, how it exposes insecurity, dismantles control, and fractures ego, it's time to go a step further. It's no longer enough to just observe this dynamic. You must now learn to use it, to turn silence from a shield into a weapon, to go from passive restraint to deliberate power. In the next part, I'll show you exactly how to do that. You'll learn how to walk into any interaction, any disagreement, any emotional trap, and win without saying a single word. Because knowing the power of silence is only the beginning. Using it with precision, that's transformation. And it all begins with this. Remain silent when everything in you wants to speak. This is where most people fail. The moment they feel judged, misunderstood, or challenged, they rush to explain, to correct, to defend. But every time you do that, you give away your power. You reveal that you still care too much about being seen, about being accepted, about being right. True silence is born the moment you let go of that craving. When you no longer need others to validate your thoughts, when you stop playing their emotional games, that's when silence becomes not just a pause, but a weapon. And in the next part, you'll learn exactly how to wield it. In the previous part, we explored how silence, when used with precision, becomes more than stillness. It becomes influence. Now, we move deeper into the specific ways silence functions as a powerful psychological weapon. You owe nothing to anyone, and more importantly, truth does not need to be spoken in order to exist. The first weapon of silence is observation. While others rush to fill the air with noise, talking over each other, explaining endlessly, justifying their every thought, you remain still. You observe, but you don't listen the way most people do, just waiting for a pause so you can speak. You listen like a hunter listens for footsteps in the forest, sharply, with presence, and with patience. You notice the tremble in their voice when a sensitive topic is touched. You detect the subtle contradictions between their words and their body language. You recognize insecurity wrapped in arrogance and desperation disguised as confidence. And you say nothing. Instead, you store everything, quietly, strategically, knowing that if you ever decide to speak, it will be with precision, not to argue, but to strike, not to win, but to end. That's the second weapon, timing. You learn to let silence linger. You resist the urge to fill the space, that pause. The emptiness creates tension, and tension, held properly, becomes power. While the other person speaks and waits, even begs for your reaction, and you give them nothing. something begins to crack inside them. They start to overthink. Their own mind turns against them, inventing stories, assumptions, and fears. The silence becomes a mirror they can't bear to look into. A single glance from you, held with intention and followed by silence, can carry more weight than 100 carefully crafted arguments. Then comes the third weapon, unpredictability. When you master silence, people can no longer read you. You become unreadable. And in a world where predictability is often the basis for control, your quiet presence creates unease. They don't know if you agree or disagree, if you're calm or furious, if you'll walk away or strike next. And because they can't anticipate you, they start playing safe. They measure their words. They lose their edge. You, in that moment, become the center of gravity in every conversation. You no longer orbit their emotions. They orbit yours. Your silence, filled with presence and intention, becomes command. But take this to heart. Do not mistake silence for passivity. This kind of silence is not weakness. Nietzsche never stood for resignation or apathy. The silence we're speaking of is active. It holds energy. It holds choice. It holds the restrained power of someone who is not reacting, but calculating. You're not holding back because you have nothing to say. You're holding back because you're positioning yourself. You're conserving strength. You're preparing. And when the moment finally comes, when your silence has already done most of the talking, you release just one line, one precise, sharp sentence. You don't raise your voice. You don't explain. You simply drop truth like a blade. It doesn't shake the room because it's loud. It shakes the room because it's undeniable. But this mastery of silence brings us to a more fragile truth. Until now, we've explored how silence can be used to win, to command, to defend, to assert your presence. But there are moments in life when it's no longer about winning. It's about surviving, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually. There are times when the people around you aren't debating with you. They're using you, manipulating you, feeding on your responses, draining your energy without ever needing to raise their voice. And you, without noticing it, you keep giving it away, every day, bit by bit. At this point, silence changes its nature. It's no longer the silence of power. It's the silence of someone who has forgotten how to speak for themselves. A silence that doesn't protect. It cries quietly from deep within. This is the turning point. The shadow side of silence. In the next part, we'll step into this darker space. We'll explore what happens when silence becomes a prison. When your voice disappears, not by choice, but by habit, by fear, by exhaustion, and most importantly, how to take it back. How to return to the kind of silence that liberates, not the kind that suffocates. Are you ready to face that truth? Let's move forward. In the previous part, we uncovered a difficult truth, that silence, when misused, can become a quiet surrender. Now, it's time to expose this manipulation for what it truly is. You may think you're simply avoiding conflict, but what if, while you're choosing silence for the sake of peace, someone else is quietly building their empire on your compliance? Nietzsche saw this long ago. Is there anything more perverse than being silenced? Yes, being conditioned to believe that silence is your only option. That suppressing your anger, yielding in arguments, and avoiding confrontation at all costs is a mark of maturity. That staying quiet is a virtue. But what if this belief is not wisdom? What if it's a trap? Nietzsche called it out with brutal honesty. What many call peace is often nothing more than a carefully trained surrender. a form of domestication that teaches you to trade your voice for acceptance, your presence for approval. Think about it. Have you noticed how certain people thrive in your silence? How they take advantage of your calmness, your habit of listening more than speaking, your aversion to tension? They push their opinions as if they were facts. They claim the space you once occupied, and you let them quietly, politely, believing it's the mature thing to do. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight, that maintaining harmony is more important, that it's not really a big deal. But deep down, something stings. Because the truth is this: you were paying a heavy price for a piece that was never truly yours. And even worse, you were being used by those who have figured out your pattern. They know you won't push back. They know you'll nod, smile, and step aside. And so, they keep taking. Nietzsche called this the morality of slaves, a value system invented by the powerless to survive in a world ruled by the powerful. It's a morality built on guilt, on self-suppression, on being agreeable to a fault. An invisible code that teaches you to shrink, to submit, to conform, and still feel righteous for doing so. But Nietzsche didn't write for the submissive. He spoke to those who dare to see through the illusion. Those who realize they've been living on their knees and finally decide to stand up. When you accept the kind of silence that devours you from within, you give up your power without even realizing it. You begin to shape your behavior around others' expectations. You become a character in their story, not the author of your own. You stop being you and start becoming whatever they need you to be. And that, Nietzsche believed, is the exact opposite of the will to power. Because true power isn't about shouting over others or controlling people. It's about mastering yourself. It's about reclaiming the authorship of your story. Choosing silence, not out of fear, but from strength. Not because you're trying to avoid discomfort, but because you owe no explanations to anyone. This submissive silence, the kind born from fear and guilt, must die. It must give way to a new silence, one that carries presence, not passivity. A silence that does not bend, does not apologize, and never asks for permission to exist. A silence that stands firm in the middle of chaos and shifts the atmosphere without speaking a word. This is the kind of silence Nietzsche would admire. The silence of someone who has faced themselves and come out whole. Someone who has become the master of their own presence. But that raises a deeper question. How do we get there? How do we transform from being a pawn in someone else's game to becoming the sovereign of our own being? How do we kill the slave morality that lives quietly within us and rise into the self-possessed silence of power? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next part, how to make this shift from submission to self-mastery, and what it truly takes to become unshakable from within. Let's move forward. We've just seen how silence, when used with intention, separates the self-aware from the easily manipulated. Now, let's take the final step toward becoming someone whose very presence commands respect. Even without a word, the path to that kind of transformation begins with one of Nietzsche's most powerful and misunderstood ideas, the Bermensch. We've mentioned him before. But now, it's time to go deeper. It's time to ask, what does it actually take to become this new kind of human? What does it look like to live as someone who no longer plays by society's rules, but writes their own? Because the truth is, the world doesn't need more talkers. It's already loud. What the world craves desperately is those who can master silence and rule from within it. This is where we've arrived, the edge of the old self, and the beginning of something far more powerful, And so I need you to truly understand this with every fiber of your being. Silence is not absence. It is not emptiness. It is not a pause between words. True silence is pure presence. It is the clarity of someone who no longer reacts to the world. They shape it. Not with noise, not with demands, but with the sheer weight of who they've become. Nietzsche never wrote for those who wanted to simply survive. His philosophy wasn't meant for the timid. He wrote for those who are ready to rise, to transcend. He wrote for those who are willing to rip off the masks they've worn for years, even if it's painful. He spoke to the few willing to become more than what they were told to be. The silence of the Bermensch is not the silence of fear, or of cowardice, or submission. No, it is the silence of the warrior who has already won before the battle even begins. It's the stillness of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, not because they're hiding, but because they know who they are. And more importantly, they know what they're worth. Now stop and look at your own life. How many times have you stayed silent because you were afraid of confrontation, because you didn't want to upset anyone, because you didn't want to be misunderstood? How many times have you let others speak over your truth, while you nodded quietly, just trying to keep the peace? Enough, Nietzsche would say. Living like that is an insult to existence itself. That kind of silence, the silence born from guilt or fear, is not noble. It's a betrayal, a slow death of the self. But from this moment on, your silence must evolve. It can no longer be a place to hide. It must become a shout without sound, a signal that you are drawing a line, that you will no longer betray yourself to be understood. Because here's the truth: who you are does not need to be explained. It needs to be lived, fully, boldly, unapologetically, and that requires courage. So do you have it? If you do, write in the comments below. I choose the silence that commands respect. Not for me, for you. Let it be a public commitment. Let it be the first step in stepping into the version of yourself who doesn't shrink, who doesn't explain, who simply is. Because even words about silence carry power when spoken with intention. And don't stop here. The next video will take you even further. It will expand on what you've awakened here and push your understanding to a whole new level. Watch it, not because I ask, but because you deserve to go beyond. And always remember, the weak shout, the strong stay silent, and the wise, they choose when. Let's continue.